So today is the United Nations International Democracy Day. It was first commemorated back in 2007. The aim then was to highlight democracies and to encourage people to keep them alive. Let's speak about this with Professor Ursula van Beek from the Center for Research on Democracy at the University of Stellenbosch. A very good evening to you, Professor. Good to have your time. I wonder what your assessment is of democracy and whether we are going forward or regressing, not just globally, but here in South Africa.
Well, the general consensus has it that we are actually regressing, but we have just published a book which shows a little bit of a more positive picture, namely that democracies have a tendency to move forward, move backwards, and then move forward again. But generally speaking, democracy is not in a good place at the moment. Globally, and the same applies to South Africa. I'm afraid that is the case. But I think that we shouldn't despair too much, despite the dire situation that we observe every day here in terms of people not having security in their homes, people having no jobs, and generally the atmosphere being rather down. But we have some positive aspects of democracy as well. Yes. And one of them, the most important one, I think, is that we have still strong institutions. And as long as the media are free, as long as we can all express our views, as long as the judiciary decides what is right, what is wrong in terms of the rule of law, we have still those two strong pillars on which we can rebuild our democracy.
Why is it then, given that those pillars still exist, that we are seeing this regression? Because, for example, one of the big conversations in the West, especially when you look around immigration, etc., domestic populations feel as though they're having to share the little they have with migrant communities, etc., and they think that is taking away from them. It's a similar conversation when you look at South Africa as well and some of the xenophobic trends of the past. But what else is contributing to the regression of democracy?
I think you quite rightly stress the problem of immigration, which in terms translates in many countries, including my own home country, which is Poland, into populist tendencies. And I think this has to do with people feeling exactly the same around the world, that there are certain security issues in terms of jobs and higher taxes and generally a lower level of standard of living, and that causes this backlash that we see in the form of populism. But what else, I think, contributes to the rather regretful state of democracy is, first of all, the general reconfiguration in terms of global politics. We see a sharp division rising around the war in Ukraine. We also see a lot of unresolved issues that are not being discussed, but that people engage in instead in sort of confrontational manner. So there are many different aspects to this what we call backsliding of democracy.
What is clear is that democracy is not perfect, like any other system. I wonder how we improve it then when you consider that people are, yes, you've got domestic populations that are increasingly poor, health services are deteriorating, other public services as well, and that is leading to the frustration of citizens. So how then do we strengthen and preserve democracy in order for it to work for the benefit of those people who participate, say, in elections?
Well, the beauty of democracy is that people can choose the government that they feel will look after them, because it is democracy after all. It is, a system for the people and by the people. And so elections are incredibly important, but in order to select your leaders in an informed way, one has to prepare to have democratic citizens. And I think the more we talk about democracy, the more we talk about the weaknesses that we observe, and the more citizens get involved in these discussions, especially young citizens, first-time voters, students. You know, the more we talk about it, the more excited we get about democracy, the more we realize that we can actually change things if we all stick together. And I have seen I have to say I'm very excited about the new initiative that has been created by the Interface Forum, which again shows how strong civil society actually is in South Africa as opposed to other countries. Instead of fighting each other on religious grounds, we have a whole lot of leaders from all the major religions coming together and wanting to speak to the population for all those involved.
But even in South Africa, NGOs are receiving a lot of criticism, backlash, if you will. Just 2 weeks ago, when there was that fire in the Marshalltown area, which tragically killed 77 people who lived in a hijacked building because of multiple reasons, be it immigration, be extreme levels of poverty, a housing crisis in this country, the government officials who were first at the scene blamed NGOs because in this country it was NGOs who took up the fight to prevent government just evicting people and leaving them on the street because the Constitution does not allow that. Let's talk to the role of NGOs in growing a democracy and how perhaps they can be protected from assault by governments.
Well, you know, NGOs in a well-functioning democracy, NGOs should not be attacked. They should not be made to feel that they are responsible for the shortcomings of the government. So essentially what it comes back to is always the same thing, that you have to have leaders who will not point fingers at NGOs, but will encourage the contribution to building a strong democracy. And that burning on the building in Johannesburg is a shocking example of negligence, which, where the blame for it is being shifted elsewhere.
And the theme this year in terms of democracy, the United Nations talks about empowering the next generation, the youth.
That's right.
How interested is the youth in democracy today? Are they encouraged or are they more despondent?
Well, it's difficult to gauge this, but I have to say that from my own experience running the Center for Research on Democracy, and, we have a monthly newsletter, and I find that young people actually approach us with the request that they can publish something because they feel their voices count. So it is difficult for me to gauge to what extent that sort of covers, how many people are really interested. But the encouraging thing is that young people do reach out and they do want to take part in the conversation, which is really very important.
And lastly, when we talk about democracy, people, and perhaps we've also framed it in that way for the moment, we focus on elections, for example, the very basic issues, but you see how the erosion of democracy can also work against the population and what's happening in Libya at the moment, right? They've had a natural disaster, massive flooding that's killed over 11,000 people, and even the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, was saying, for example, when you look at what's happened, much of it is the consequence of a collapse of democracy, because since the removal from the picture of Muammar Gaddafi, you've got two rival governments running this country, and there was simply no protections for citizens in the event of what happened in Derna and surrounds.
Well, this is just what happens when democracy collapses. And, I think that the system, whether it's democratic or not, but particularly in democracy, must be judged by what it delivers to its people, especially at times of crisis, especially at a time of natural disasters. You can then gauge to what extent the government is actually capable and caring enough to help people.
Thank you very much for speaking to us, Professor Ursula van Beek with the University of Stellenbosch. Thank you for your time.